thank you very much for this invitation and for the possibility to share some thoughts with you. This is a kind of ongoing research that I would like to present you and discuss with you afterwards. And so it's about the possibility of a materialist philosophy of contemporary art. So I don't have to tell you that we're living in politically troubled times. The rise of authoritarianism, war, militarization, the destruction of the environment, and the threat of AI rendering obsolete human labor, and so on. And we can see in all this, we can see these developments as different facets of a general crisis of globalized capitalism. And in this context, artistic production and intellectual production is, of course, put under pressure in different ways. The public spending in arts is cut in many places. There are different forms of censorship and self-censorship. And so uneasy times for artistic production and intellectual production. And in this situation, of course, the question is pressing. We are pushed to answer the question, well, why is art necessary? Why is art, what is the function, the social function of art? What is the legitimacy of contemporary artistic production? And the notion of materialism in this context is often charged with a kind of promise to be, let's say, a progressive stance in this situation. That the materialist conception of art would be a kind of progressive way to answer this question. What is the legitimacy and what is the function of art? And now I will try to look at this question philosophically, so stepping back and asking myself, okay, what are the theoretical options here? What does it mean to talk about materialism in this context, and what are the different theoretical options how to have a materialist conception of art? And so just a short overview. I will first say something about the notion of materialism and distinguish three different ways to understand materialism: metaphysical, mythological, and critical materialism. And based on this third notion, the notion of critical materialism of the Marxist tradition, I would like to ask the question, okay, what would be a critical materialist conception of art, or philosophy of art, or art theory? And I would like to propose, in the many, many different variants that there exists of materialist theories of arts, I would like to highlight three variants, three versions that I put like this. Art can be conceived as a confirmation of its material conditions, as an expression, or as an understanding of its material conditions. So this is the plan. So, but to begin with, when the word materialism appears in recent contemporary art discourse, probably most persons will associate it with the new materialisms that have had a quite strong influence on the art discourse, let's say in the 2010s, in the last decades. Theories like those of Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, and other publications, Jane Bennett, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, or also in the field of music and sound arts, Christopher Cox, Sonic Flux. These are theories that have been associated with the term materialism. And so, in which sense are these theories materialists? Well, materialist refers here to the concept of matter, of the material world, of material stuff. And matter is what natural sciences describe. Matter is the spatio-temporal stuff that is in causal relations and that is the object of natural sciences. And what is excluded from this description of reality, of the natural scientific description of reality, are entities like subjectivity, intentionality, consciousness. So spiritual entities, one could say, ideal entities, they are not matter, no? Matter is the object realm of the natural scientific description. So that would be a metaphysical materialism. The question, the metaphysical or ontological question is, What kind of things are there in the world? What kind of things constitute reality? And the materialist answer to this metaphysical or ontological question is the only thing that exists, the only kind of entities that exist are material entities. Stuff, spatio-temporal stuff, objects of natural scientific inquiry. And of course, configurations of these material entities. But there are no ideal entities, there are no such things as spiritual entities or ideal objects. This metaphysical materialism has a consequence that is important for these contemporary discourses. It radically decenters the human subject from the description of the world. Because the human beings have always been at the center of the general description of the universe and the world because of their capacity, spiritual capacities, because of consciousness, because of subjectivity, because of intentionality. But if you have a description of the universe that gets rid of these concepts, which are subject-related, you have a description or a conception of the world, of reality, where human beings are just one kind of things among different material things. And this is the aspect of the metaphysical materialism that has become extremely important in the debates, also in the art discourses of the last centuries. But these new materialisms are not a simple confirmation of the natural scientific worldview. On the contrary, the specific twist of these new materialisms is to propose a kind of re-enchantment of the material world. So they take the vocabulary and the terminology of natural sciences, but they attribute to these material entities properties that are normally attributed only to human subjects. Properties like agency, activity, vitality. Now, these are the most important properties. So they say agency, activity, vitality are properties that are all over, distributed all over the material world. All kind of material things have agency, vitality, and activity. This is, of course, very different from a natural scientific description of the world, no? Which excludes these kind of concepts. And these authors, especially Jane Bennett and also Donna Haraway, they're very conscious about this gap between the natural scientific description and their proposal, their new materialisms. And they say they say themselves that what they propose is not a scientific theory. They do not propose ontologies or metaphysical theories, but they say, Jane Bennett says, she proposes ontotales, ontostories. And Donna Haraway says her texts are an articulation of speculative fabulation. So it's not argumentative theory, but rather something like stories, narrative proposals, in order to get a new relation, to articulate a new relation to our environment and to our world. One could say, with an older concept, that these are forms of new mythologies. Not scientific theories, but new mythologies. New mythologies that take the vocabulary of metaphysical materialism and enchant them, enrich them, magnify them into a different kind of general worldview. And of course, the programmatic goal of this series is normally a political activist goal in the context of the environmental crisis. One sees this kind of blurring of boundaries between science and mythology, quasi-religion, in the very end of the book by Jane Bennett, where she ends the book with a credo of new materialism. And I read this quote: "I believe in one matter energy, the maker of things seen and unseen. I believe that this pluriverse is traversed by heterogeneities that are continually doing things. I believe it is wrong to deny vitality to non-human bodies, forces, and forms, and that a careful course of anthropomorphization can help reveal that vitality, even though it resists full translation and exceeds my comprehensive grasp. So there's the difference to scientific argumentation, right? I believe that encounters with lively matter can chasten my fantasies of human mastery, highlight the common materiality of all that is, expose a wider distribution of agency, and reshape the self and its interests. So this is how the book ends of Jane Bennett. And of course, it's somehow tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of ironic use of a credo, because she's still doing something more scientific. But in a way, it's also serious that these theories are not scientific theories in the narrow sense, but are onto tales, onto stories, new mythologies. So this is just to introduce you to a contemporary form of materialism, and I would say it is important to distinguish these different conceptions of materialism from what I am going to talk about, and which I will will name critical materialism. So we've seen the metaphysical materialism is the theory of what there is. What kind of entities constitute the universe. And the claim is all there is matter, so all there is can be described by natural scientists. I mean, that's, of course, a simplification, but that's the general direction. And now you have enchanted versions of it, mythological versions of it, which would be the new materialism, where they say, yeah, but all matter is somehow charged, endowed with vitality and agency. No? So it's also a general claim about the universe, but different from, let's say, the physicalist scientific point of view. But both variants of materialism are metaphysical materialism. Are claims about what there is, what the universe is made of. Now, the tradition of critical materialism in the, let's say, in the tradition of Marxist thought is a different attempt. It's a different kind of question they try to answer. I would say it is a reflection on intellectual production. And more specifically, it is a critique, the materialist stance is a critique of idealism. Now, idealism means the isolation of ideas and thoughts from the social context in which they emerge. The idealist point of view says that we can understand the history, the development, and the setup of ideas and thoughts in isolation, in themselves. We can write a history of ideas, we can write a history of culture, a history of right, a history of religion, a history of politics, philosophy, science, and for us, most importantly, a history of art and a theory of art, without considering the functions and the dependencies of these spheres from the social context in which they emerge. And the materialist position, the materialism, the critical materialism, is the critique of this kind of conception, is the critique of the isolation of intellectual production. So there is no claim about what the universe is made of, what constitutes the universe. That's not part of there might be critical materialisms that are based on some metaphysical theory, but it's not given. No? It's not something that is implied already by the critical materialist project itself, but it is first it is at the core a reflection on the embeddedness of intellectual production in the social contexts in which they emerge, or in which they function. Now, if you say it like this, you would say, okay, but that's trivial. I mean, that's what all humanities are doing all the time, all critical all cultural studies, art history, and humanities. What they're doing is essentially contextualizing, historicizing, talking about historical context. So that would mean that all these humanities that are done today would be forms of critical materialism. So we have to specify a little bit, and it is the notion of social context that is understood in a very particular way in the tradition of critical materialism. And it is understood, so the idea is that the intellectual production, culture, law, religion, political discourse, philosophy, science, and art, that this intellectual production is embedded in a social formation characterized by a mode of production. So it's not any social context that it interested, but the social formation that is characterized by a certain mode of production. Of course, the mode of productions that the typical types are slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. No, these are the big names. And then you have subcategories and more refined terminologies. But every such mode of production has two aspects, or is characterized by two sides. On the one hand, there are the means of production, so the technologies, the natural resources, the human resources, the competencies that are entered into the production process. And on the other hand, you have the relations of production, so how the whole production and social reproduction is organized. These together characterize a specific mode of production. And the case that is interesting for us, of course, is the capitalist mode of productions and the particular form of organization, so the relations of production that are specific for capitalists are things like the private ownership of the means of production, that the production is generally realized as a commodity production, commodities that are exchanged on the market, that the labor that goes into production itself has the form of a commodity that is exchanged on the labor market, and that the incentive, the motive of production is the accumulation of capital, so the realization of profits, and which leads to a certain division of labor, a division of those subjects who are in possession of the means of production and those who can only sell their labor, which leads to a division of the society into different groups, into different classes which have different interests and in that sense are in an antagonistic relation. I mean, that would be a sketch of what is the specific relation of production for the capitalist mode of production. I won't go into detail, but just to remind you, okay, that's the particularity of a materialist account of the social context in which intellectual production is embedded. Now, the classic model of a materialist critique has this form. You say there is the intellectual production, some call it ideology, some call it superstructure, and this intellectual production is embedded in the material conditions, that means the basis, the substructure. The material conditions have these different aspects. The means of production, technological, natural resources, human resources, and the organization of production, the relations of production, and as a consequence of this specific organization, the composition of society, the social composition, the division into classes and groups, and yeah. But you always also have the materialist reflection on this context itself. So there is a kind of intellectual production, which is the materialist theory, the materialist reflection, which reflects upon the relation between intellectual production and material conditions. This is the classic model of a materialist, of a critical materialist analysis of intellectual production in general. And now, having this in mind, we can now go next step and say, okay, well, how could this be applied to art? What would it mean to have a materialist account, a materialist conception of art? Now, the question is, what is the relation between artistic production and the material conditions? And so I would suggest that there are three interesting ways how to understand this relation, and which I try to label with these three concepts. Now, art can be a confirmation of its material conditions. It can be the expression, and it can be a form of understanding of its material conditions. Now, for the first variants. So these are different variants of materialist theories of art. The first variant conceives art as confirmation. So you see, I always use now the same model. The basic model is the same, but the different parts of the model are understood in a different way. So in this version of materialism, on the level of material conditions, the focus is on the class relation, on the class antagonism. So the classical idea goes, in every society we have different social groups, different classes that are in antagonistic relations to each other, and one of these groups is the ruling class, is the dominating class. And art, being a luxury product, it is always predominantly produced, commissioned, and consumed by the members of this ruling class. Now, the materialist analysis goes like this. These specific material conditions always produce or go hand in hand with an intellectual production that corresponds with the intellectual production of the ruling class. So there is the articulation of specific values, ideals, mythologies, life worlds, experiences, subject forms, worldviews, whatever you want, whatever you put into this, under this label of intellectual production, which corresponds to the ruling class, so only a part of the society, the ruling class. Let's call this whole bundle the consciousness of the ruling class. In the case of capitalism, one would say it's bourgeois consciousness. And now, artistic production, in this variant of materialist conception of art, the artistic production is essentially a confirmation of bourgeois consciousness, a confirmation of the consciousness of the ruling class. So it confirms, reproduces, amplifies, magnifies, celebrates the ideas and values and life forms and subject forms which are those of the ruling class at a certain historical point. And artistic production does this by rendering these ideas and values sensible, to symbolize them or to create intensive experiences of these rather abstract ideas and mythologies. So a materialist theory of art in this variant, in this first variant, takes the form of a critique of ideology. Artistic production is part of the ideology of the ruling class, and the materialist critique analyzes this relation. Now, I just give you some examples so that you can have an idea how could that work. A classical text is by Meyer Shapiro, Social Basis of Art, The Social Basis of Art, a text from the 30s. And he doesn't talk about specific examples, but he talks about modern painting. And you could imagine something like this painting by Henri Matisse. And he says, okay, modern painting, who is producing, consuming, and commissioning this art? It is the bourgeois subject, the urban bourgeois subject living in the late 19th century or beginning 20th century, mainly in the cities, in the metropoles. This bourgeois subject doesn't have to work. That's the particularity. The bourgeois subject is not forced to work. It's not necessary for her or him to work in order to live, but it lives from the. It's a rentier, no? So his or her life form is essentially passive. It's not an active. The bourgeois subject is not active in the production process, but is a passive spectator, of a passive consumer of different goods. Spends his life doing promenades in the city, in the park, looking at landscapes, decorating their rooms, their interiors, reading stuff, and searching for some kind of experiences of pleasure in the whole multiplicity of contingent things that surrounds them. And now Meyer Shapiro says, look at modernist painting. This is exactly what modernist painting depict. This is just the subject matter of modernist painting. It's the contingent things of the bourgeois life which allow for some intricate aesthetic pleasures. So pipes and newspapers and fruits on a table in the interior, a view from a hotel room on the lake, landscape, city scenes, the park, contingent objects, which surprisingly allow for aesthetic pleasure. And Meyer Shapiro goes on and says, not only the content, so the subject matter, what is depicted in the modernist painting confirms the bourgeois consciousness, but also the form, the formal experiments that on the one hand celebrate individualism. No, every artist has his own style. Matisse realizes his individuality in finding a total unique formal style, formal language, but also by rendering the spatio-temporal relations between the depicted objects bizarre and deconstructs the depicted space. The things that are depicted are not available for pragmatic action or something like this, but they become a kind of bizarre, unstable objects of passive spectation. They become a spectacle, and you don't know exactly how these things are related to each other, but they are in an interesting, fascinating way destabilized. So that's how Meyer Shapiro reads modernist painting. It's a critical stance, huh? And he says modernist painting is essentially the confirmation of bourgeois subjectivity. Now we could use this model also, I think, quite easily for some contemporary artistic positions. And I would take the art of Olafur Eliasson. I take just, it's more or less a random example, but I guess you know these spectacular installations of Olafur Eliasson. Here's the Moss Wall. Here is an installation called Life, where the gallery space is flooded by green-colored water. Here's the algae window. And you could say, okay, contemporary art, who commissions, consumes, produces predominantly contemporary art? Well, it's a part of the ruling class. We could say liberal, democratic, green liberals. And what is the topics they are interested in? Of course, they're totally the relation, the crisis of the relation to nature is one of the predominant problems this part of society is thinking about. And so that's the subject matter of Olafur Eliasson's art. It's all about the climate crisis, the catastrophe of global warming, and the different different questions how we can represent this catastrophic developments. So that's the content. But also, then you can say, what is the form? What is the specific way these topics are represented? Well, you have these spectacular installations that on the one hand produce this kind of sublime awe in front of the catastrophic development, no? So you say climate crisis is such a huge catastrophic development that you have this kind of sublime awe. And at the same time, the formal perfection, this cleanness, this high-tech quality that you find in these installations somehow bear the promise that the solution to this kind of problems would be a kind of technological solution. So that in the end, the domination of nature, the technological and organizational domination of nature would be the solution to cope with the problem of climate crisis. So you could say, well, that's exactly the consciousness of a certain part of the ruling class, of green liberals, who are preoccupied with global warming and somehow have the unconscious hope that there is some kind of technological fix. And Olafur Eliasson just confirms it. So you see, in the way I presented, this kind of approach is somehow problematic. And I would say the most important problem is that when you are dealing with convincing work of art, you cannot reduce the work of art to an affirmation of such a clear value of a certain social group. So the mapping of what the artwork affirms, what it claims, and some forms of consciousness of specific social group. This mapping is very difficult to realize when the artworks in questions are really convincing. So there's a certain ambiguity in convincing artworks that, does not allow for this kind of clear mapping what kind of class consciousness is now expressed in which artwork. So there is a second variant of materialist theory that has the same basic model, but fills these different positions in the model very differently. And that is the approach, the second approach. I would say that would say art is understood as an expression of its material conditions. Now, on the level of the material conditions, it's not so much about class antagonism and the division of different social groups with their consciousness, but it's about the general organization of production, of society at a certain point in time, and the technological developments that go that are implied in this organization. And these material conditions, according to the second variant, are somehow unconsciously expressed in the cultural forms and styles or structures of feeling in the intellectual production. So in science, in art, but also in cultural industry and different forms of cultural production. So there would be something like a general style of a certain time, a general cultural style, which unconsciously expresses the general organizational and technological stage of society. So somehow the basic model is the same, but as you change the content, it's a very different claim, right? It's a very different analysis. And so what the materialist conception of art does is a kind of social reading, a social deciphering of general cultural forms. So you see the difference to the first model, to the confirmation model, is that there is no correspondence here between cultural expressions and some particular social classes and class consciousness. That's not the operation. The operation is rather there is a correspondence between the general organization of the society at a certain point and cultural styles. And a very exciting book that I would recommend because it's well written, a very polemic book that follows this approach is the Anna Kornbluth's book, Immediacy or the Style of Too Late Capitalism, that was published a year ago, and which applies exactly this model. In a general polemical discussion of contemporary cultural production stemming from TV series to poetry to scientific theories to whatever you want. So a very fascinating book. And I just want to sketch what the claim of the book is. So Anna Kornbluth says, what are the material conditions of contemporary cultural production? She says what she calls too late capitalism. It's an economic situation that goes back to the 1970s, and that is centrally characterized by a predominance of circulation, of the sphere of circulation over the sphere of production. So what does it mean? The claim is that since the crisis of the 1970s, there is a secular stagnation, so a stagnation of productivity. And there are several historians of economy who describe the development like this, and she draws on this and says this crisis led to a phase of capitalism where the accumulation of capital, so the realization of profits, could not be realized in the increase of productivity, but in the increase in the intensification of circulation of capital itself circulation of information, circulation of goods. So by rendering this circulation more intense and more fast, by accelerating these different forms of circulations, profits could be realized in the last decades, but not by the increase of productivity. So this is what is particular for the contemporary mode of production, of capitalist mode of production. And she says, it is this organizational and technological situation. I mean, many people talked in the recent decades about we live in the informational capitalism, digitalized capitalism. These are different names, no, for this predominance of the circulation sphere. And she says this situation is unconsciously expressed in a general cultural style that predominates the cultural production from TV series to high art performances, and that she calls the style of immediacy. Now, immediacy means negation of mediation. So she observes that there is a stress on immersion, immersive installation art and immersive settings in art, a stress on bodily affection, direct interpellation, and the celebration of presence in many cultural forms of today. And the example which she starts is the famous performance of Marina Abramovic. The artist is present. No? And she says, the cringe reality TV shows and this highbrow art performance have exactly the same style. It is about nothing else than the mere immediate presence of a person in the room that is somehow fascinating and unbearable to live with. There is no content, no reference, no meaning, no web of mediations that it has played. It's reduced to the mere presence, immediacy of a subject that is staring in your eyes. And she says, this celebration of presence, of immediacy, also goes hand in hand with a personalization of artistic production. So the stress on biography, on lived experiences, and anti-fictionality, so that people who write books, they do not invent fictional characters, but they do autofiction or autoethnography. So they tell their own story in a kind of modified way. There is a blurring of genre boundaries between theoretical writing, poetry, and other forms of text that all, according to Anna Kornbluh, that all stress this idea of rendering more drastic, more authentic, more direct the ideas that are communicated. And as a third layer, or as a third aspect of this style of immediacy, she says, in general, the lived experiences, the experience of life are somehow simplified and reduced, discretized, so rendered discrete, put into images, simplified to images that can enter the flux of information, so that can be efficiently shared, efficiently communicated. No, a kind of, so she calls this the discretization. So complex lived experiences are simplified to discrete images that can enter the flows of communication and circulation. So these are the main aspects she identifies as the style of immediacy. And you see, she would say this kind of negation of mediation, negation of distance, corresponds and expresses somehow unconsciously the negation of distance that is central to the contemporary form of capital accumulation in a capitalism that is where the sphere of circulation dominates over the sphere of production. That's the picture. And I give you another example, which is kind of amusing, that she mentions with regard to the style of immediacy in video. It's an example from a film that is called Uncut Gems by the Safdie brothers. Kornbluh calls this the formal strategy of this excerpt, colonoscopy cinematography. So I give you the quote. Colonoscopy cinematography may not yet be recognized as a great art of our moment. And indeed, the Safdie brothers and Darius Khondji were snubbed by the 2020 Oscars. But this incredible 90-second sequence, compositing actual scope video, digital animation, microscopic gem photography, and 35mm film shot on locations, consolidates immediacy as video style. How close can the camera get? Not just sweat beds and skin imperfection, but orifice penetration and organ texture. Not just tight shots in tiny spaces, but chittering cuts jibbing the lurking guts and racing pulse of the gambling protagonist. How close can the spectator get? Intimate, internalized, poop-streaked, inside an anti-hero relentlessly driven to gut-wrenching bins. What does video see? The peristalsis of the tubes, circulation squeezing when there is nothing left to produce. So, I mean, you see that the whole book is in this style, so it's quite amusing to read. And the general correspondence she tries to analyze is clear. No? She says, we have here a certain kind of video style that corresponds to a specific material situation. And Kornbluh's text she understands her approach clearly as a continuation of the famous text by Frederick Jameson that is called Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So the original essay is from '84, but the book itself is, I think, in the beginning of the '90s. So an earlier book, but she tries to continue the same kind of materialist conception, the materialist analysis of culture. And maybe just very briefly to compare these two analyses. So Jameson talked about more or less the same, an earlier phase of the same period of capital that he calls late capitalism. But the important feature for Jameson was the shift from nation-centered imperialist monopoly capitalism to post-colonial multinational capitalism that was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So an international division of labor where the industries were relocated to let's say the global south, or however you want to talk it, and in the West people started to talk about post-industrial society, no? Because industrial production was delocated, and this, let's say, global expansion of capitalism and global expansion of the division of labor was accompanied by a real subsumption of all aspects of life under capitalism. So all aspects of life are commodified, are part of the become subsumed under the logic of capitalism, including the cultural production and avant-garde. And this complete subsumption of all spheres of life under capitalism and the global expansion of capitalism was for Frederick Jameson specific for this situation that also, let's say, starts in the 60s, 70s. And he said that this development, late capitalism, somehow is unconsciously expressed in the postmodern style. And for him, he did not talk about style, but he said it is a structure of feeling, the postmodern structure of feeling. And what was this for Jameson? He was talking about typical postmodernist motives are the waning of affects, the schizoid feeling of unreality, that we are surrounded by images, by signs which have no reference to a real life experience or real entities. Meaning in the theoretical production, postmodern theory, meaning is an effect of a surface effect of a play of science. In poststructuralism, the artistic strategies are pastiche and camp, where ancient old styles, historical styles, are used but as mere images without any reasonable connection to the real historical past. and the predominance of space over time, but a hyperspace, a labyrinthic space without orientation, which replaces the clear temporal progression that is, of course, the idea of modernism, progress in time. So a crisis of historicity. So these were the cultural phenomena that Jameson tried to somehow map on this material situation of globalized capitalism and complete subsumption of all parts of life under the commodity form. And so the difference of these two analyses can be understood quite clearly when we consider again, so the main example of Kornblue of today's immediacy style is Marina Abramovic sitting as a real person in front of the spectator. And one of Jameson's important examples of postmodernism were these sculptures by Dwayne Hanson. This is the Delivery Man from 1980s. So these are wax figures, but hyper-realistic wax figures that are distributed in gallery spaces and museums. And the effect of these wax figures is that when you encounter this, you see this sculpture, and you look around and you see people standing still in front of paintings, you start not to be sure whether these are wax figures as well or whether these are human beings. No? And this somehow shocking experience that all of a sudden you look and you see, are there really persons here? Is this real? Or am I just surrounded by simulacra, by fakes, by wax figures? This is the postmodern feeling of derealization. No? Jameson would say this is the schizophrenic break of the chains of signification. That's how he framed it over. But this moment where you say, oh, maybe this play of science has absolutely no, this play of images had absolutely no connection to some real presence. That was the postmodern feeling, and which is clearly, let's say, contrary to what Kornblue identifies as the contemporary celebration of presence. No? But this comparison also shows that, I mean, this whole approach of materialist critique has also some problems. The first is the concept of a cultural style, a hegemonic, predominant style of an cultural style of an epoch, like the postmodern or immediacy. I mean, these are extremely large and unifying concepts, which of course ignore all the differences, all the contradictions that are, they simplify the situation enormously, right? So this is, of course, one problem. Another problem is, of course, also that you can say Jameson and Kornblue are essentially talking about the same kind of period, and how can it be that the culture styles are so different? But Kornblue tries to give an answer to this. But a more serious problem is that both Jameson and Kornblue do not make a distinction between art and cultural industry. In Jameson, or art in an emphatic sense and cultural industry. Jameson has a kind of ambivalent position because he says some postmodern artworks are good. So he likes postmodern architecture, for example. So it's not at all that all these cultural forms are somehow failures. And he tries to map these developments and compare it with the social situation. Kornblue, on the contrary, is highly polemical. She's highly critical about this immediacy style, and her book is essentially a call for returning to mediation, distance, critical reflections, in theory and in art. And if you have this kind of claim, this critical claim, this polemical claim, of course you have to presuppose something like artistic production that would be more than just an unconscious expression of the social situation, of the social reality in which it emerges. And that would exactly be the artwork that includes distance, reflection, and mediation. So there is a problem in Kornblue that corresponds to what Rüdiger Bubner already in an old text from the 80s identified as the aporia of materialist aesthetics in general. That's how he called it, and it can be put very simply. If art is part of ideology, so if art is mere ideology, in which sense can it still be art in an emphatic way? And in which sense can there be something like a materialist theory of art in an emphatic sense? But if art is more than ideology, if art is itself not merely an unconscious expression, a symptom of its time, but in which sense can we say that art is still materially conditioned? So in which sense is such a theory of art still a materialist theory of art? And I think the problem is to be taken seriously, but I would suggest that there is a third understanding of the material, a third way, a third variant how to conceive a materialist theory of art that can cope with this problem. And that is to say art is not a confirmation and it's not an expression, but it is an act of understanding its material conditions. So you have the same basic scheme as before. It's the question about how does intellectual production and material conditions are interrelated. But artistic production, in this approach, would not be just part of the ideology. It would not just be one part of intellectual production that corresponds to a material situation, but it would itself have the same place as the material critique, as the materialist analysis of this situation. So it would be a form of reflection on the relation between intellectual production and material conditions. So the artistic production would not be just part of ideology, but it would have the same place, if you want, so to speak, as the materialist analysis of culture itself. It would be a form of reflection on this situation. And if you fill this in, if you now make it more detailed, one could say the material conditions in all their aspects are a field of contradictions, of contradictory relations. And these material conditions produce a whole realm of intellectual entities, forms of subjectivity, types of rationality, the different media of communication, so language, visual means of communications, conventions of musical convention, visual conventions. And all these forms and media, of course, are worked and manifest themselves in the cultural industry, in historical artworks that enter the cultural industry and are reproduced, and of course in all the kind of mythologies and narratives and stories that structure contemporary life. But the artistic production would take this whole field of intellectual production as its material and elaborate forms, the form of the artwork, based on this material. So it would be an elaboration of this of the intellectual production as a material. So the artworks then would be understood as forms of self-critical reflections on intellectual production. So the artwork would not be a mere confirmation of a class consciousness. It would not be the somehow unconscious expression of a state of the material conditions, but it would self be an articulation of a specific understanding how thoughts and ideas and intellectual productions relate to the contradictory material production conditions in which they emerge. So artistic production would have somehow the same kind of function as the materialist theory, the materialist philosophy, but art differs from philosophy, and this difference is of course always hard to define, but there are proposals in the history of materialist thought. One interesting theory is by Gaetano Della Volpe, who said the difference between artistic understanding and theoretical understanding of the relation between intellectual production and material conditions lies in the difference between the polysemic typification of art and the unequivocal typification in scientific understanding. So a scientific understanding is well-defined, unequivocal terms that articulate theories, and the artistic understanding would be an understanding that grasps reality and grasps the relations, the contradictory relations of reality in ambiguous types, in types that are polysemic. That is the suggestion by Della Volpe. And of course, one type of theory that follows this approach is also the theory of Adorno, who would say the difference between the scientific and the artistic understanding of this relation is that artworks are syntheses, so there are forms of articulation of thoughts, grasping of these complex relations, but synthesis without judgment, so that do not take the form of propositional judgments, whereas the materialist philosophy is an articulation with judgments. And one very telling formulation by Adorno is this one, where he says, the unresolved antagonisms of reality return in the artworks as immanent problems of form. Now, this might sound a little bit like the Jameson-Kornblue approach, no? That there is a return of material contradictions in the artworks, but in Adorno's theory, the artworks themselves are answers to the problems of form. So the artworks themselves articulate answers to form problem, and by articulating these answers, they articulate a certain understanding of reality, so a certain understanding of the relation between intellectual production and material conditions. And if you follow this line, artistic understanding of reality, the artistic understanding, cannot be replaced by the scientific understanding, because only the ambiguity of non-judgmental synthesis can articulate the contradictory unity of the present. That would be one reason to say that artistic understanding cannot be somehow reduced and replaced by science. So this is the point on which of course I would like now to give you a materialist reading of a contemporary artwork, but that's still up to do. These are the preliminary steps, and I hope I gave some reasons why there is this third variant is maybe the most convincing one. And to come back to the initial diagnosis that we live in times where art is under pressure, and then where we have to answer the question, what is the legitimacy of contemporary art? I would say in this situation, it is worth defending the idea that art is a form of understanding of our contemporary situation, and not merely the expression of the consciousness of certain groups, or merely the symptom of a certain state of social reality. Because only when we say that art is a necessary and irreplaceable form of understanding contemporary society, can we have good reasons to defend art against the pressure that it is exposed to at the moment. So that's my final word. Thank you very much.